Hello guys, welcome back to this week's episode of Toxic Crime Tuesdays. I've missed you all, even though I've still been here, but it's been weird to not be doing this, and I was doing spooky season as much as I absolutely loved it, but yeah, it's great to be back. This week's episode is the kind of case that leaves you with more questions than answers. Although the culprit, the alleged culprit, is behind bars, there is just so much more to this case. 2 children were brutally murdered and their mother was the #1 suspect and is the person that is currently behind bars and on death row. But what we're mainly going to be looking at, and the main question that I want to be asking you all is this person a cold-blooded killer? Or is she an innocent grieving mother? Even with not much concrete evidence against her, and a lot of evidence which hasn't really been thoroughly looked into at all, a potentially innocent woman is currently on death row. And I normally always give my opinion, and don't worry, I am going to be giving my opinion. I've watched a lot of people do this case and they tend to kind of remain on the fence, but that's just not what I do. I pretty much do, as much as I do try to remain neutral, I try to be Switzerland, I just can't. I always have to give my opinion. And when it comes to these kind of cases that are kind of who's done it case, I always have to vocalise who I think it is, basically. But what I'm going to be doing, I'm just going to be going through all of the facts. I'm going to be going through the background, the main event, the investigation, the trial, and then towards the end I will be giving you my whole opinion. So just before I dive right in, I just want to say that if, like me, you are interested in true crime and for some strange reason you like the sound of my voice, then please click the subscribe button and also turn your notifications on, because then you'll be notified every time I do a video. Even though I'm going to be doing one every single Tuesday, I might have to put in a little sneaky one just to mix it up a bit. So make sure you turn your notifications on, because then you'll know. So let's get straight into it. This case takes us to Rowlett in Texas. And I don't think I've actually done a case in Texas yet. I don't think I have anyway. But I should really know this. So maybe you're all wondering who this case is about. This is the case of Darlie Routier. So who is Darlie Routier? Well, Darlie Lynn Peck Routier was born on the 4th of January 1970 in Pennsylvania. Sometime throughout her childhood, I'm not too sure when, her and her family moved to Rowlett in Texas. And at just 15 years of age, this is when Darlie meets and soon falls in love with Darren Routier. He was 17 at the time, and just 4 years later they marry and they have their first son together, Devon, which is followed just a year later by Damon and then Drake. Darren and Darlie had the kind of life that I think a lot of people would be quite envious of, and I think a lot of people was within their social circle, within their neighbourhood. Darren was a very successful businessman. He had an electrical company and it did very well. So they had quite a hefty income every single month. They managed to buy a beautiful house, which was, well, it was basically a mansion. It was huge and it was absolutely beautiful, and it was within a very well-to-do neighbourhood as well. They also splashed out on things like cars, like I think Darren had a Jag, they had a boat, they liked to go on holiday quite frequently. They love their family holidays and they like to go to more exclusive kind of resorts, which I don't blame them. But a lot of people viewed them in a negative light for their splurges, which if you've got it, flaunt it. I personally don't see the issue in that at all. Like, they spend plenty of money on their kids. It's not like they just spent it all on themselves. The kids never really had to ask for anything because they had it. And although I don't agree with spoiling children, that's another argument for another day. However, they had the dream life. So they also splashed out on things like really expensive jewellery. Darlie also had a boob job, which, fair play, good on her. A lot of people, again, viewed her in a negative light because she had a boob job, which I just find absolutely ridiculous. A lot of people just seem to view Darlie as vain, self-obsessed, because she took pride in her appearance. She wore makeup, she had a boob job, she had bleached blonde hair. Who cares? Does it affect her parenting? I highly doubt it. I wear a lot of makeup. Doesn't affect my parenting skills whatsoever. I never put wearing makeup or wearing clothes above the care and welfare of my own son, and I highly doubt that Darlie did as well. And on my research, it didn't seem like her taking pride in her personal appearance ever affected her parenting skills whatsoever. There is nothing wrong with wanting to look nice. It makes you feel good about yourself, and why shouldn't you feel good about yourself? And when you feel good about yourself, you flourish as a person. Therefore, she would become a better mother. If she feels better about herself, she would feel better about being a mother. Therefore, she would probably be happier and better to be around. So, is that an issue? No, I really don't think it is. However, the extravagant splurges seem to take a toll on the family income, and they ended up being in quite a bit of debt. They basically spent beyond their means, and they did apply for a loan which was denied, and yeah, so they were struggling a little bit, and they ended up, you know, having a lot of arguments, which obviously I think a lot of couples generally do argue quite a bit about money. That's pretty standard. Now we're going to fast forward to June the 5th, 1996. So this was in Texas. As we all know, it's the deep south. So it's very, very warm in Texas, and especially in the summer, in June, it's really hot. And on that particular night, Darren and baby Drake, he was only 8 months old at the time, they went to bed upstairs, and Darlie decided that her, Devon and Damon were going to sleep downstairs because, as we all know, heat rises. And the boys, they were very hot and bothered. I don't think it seemed to really bother the baby, but Devon and Damon, they were all hot and bothered. So they just decided to chill downstairs, watch some TV together and just sleep on the sofa. So I think Darlie went upstairs about 12 o'clock for Drake's feed, and then she went back downstairs once Drake had fallen asleep, and she joined the boys and they all fell asleep together. Just a couple of hours later, at 2:31 a.m, 911 dispatchers in Rowlett, Texas received a call from a very hysterical woman. This woman was Darlie Routier. Darlie, she rang, she was hysterical, she was frantic, she was ringing, and she was on the phone and she was crying. Like, the operator couldn't really understand what she was saying a lot during a lot of the phone call. But Darlie stated that a man had broken into her home and had stabbed her 2 children and herself as well. Darlie said that she woke up between 2 and 2:30. She said that she had woken up to a man hovering over her, and she's obviously sort of come to, because you know you'll be a bit freaked out, like, who are you? So she's jumped up, and the man has then fled the scene, and he dropped a knife. I don't think Darlie kind of realised what was happening. I think if I was like, you know, if I'd just woken up and there was a random man in my house, I'd be like, what the hell? You know, so he had dropped a knife, and she grabbed the knife, obviously, to defend herself, and ran straight after him, which is when he ran into the garage and he fled the scene. So she quickly runs back into the living room to check sort of what's happened. At this point, she didn't realise that she had actually been quite severely cut around her neck as well. And this is when she notices both of her boys lying on the floor, brutally stabbed. Once, obviously, Darlie realises this, as you can imagine, she was hysterical. She was screaming, she was crying, she was shouting both of the boys' names, trying to, you know, get them to respond. And this is when Darren wakes up, because he can hear Darlie screaming like, Damon, Damon, Devon, Devon. So he then runs downstairs, and this is when he walks into an absolute bloodbath. And he is just horrified at the scene around him. Darlie quickly rings 911, and Darren is trying to give CPR to both of the boys, so he's kind of like switching between them. Devon had been stabbed multiple times in the chest. Damon at this point, obviously he was stabbed quite a few times. He still had a pulse, however Devon did not. But Darren still tried to give Devon CPR, and this is when he noticed that the holes in and around his chest, they were just exerting air. So then Darren, bless him, like, oh, can't imagine going through that. He then starts to blow through the holes to keep the air from, you know, going out. But it becomes quite apparent that he is dead. So Darren then quickly switches to Damon, who is still alive. He's clinging on for dear life. So he goes straight over to Damon. He's trying to give Damon CPR, and Damon he's grunting, he's making noises, his eyes are moving, so he is still alive, but it's bad. So whilst Darlie is on the phone, she is screaming to the operators to hurry up, to get there quickly. She's giving them the address. She's also saying that there was an intruder in the house who had stabbed all three of them, and he had fled the scene. And then the operator says like, oh, don't touch anything. And this is when Darlie said, well, I picked up the knife. A lot of people find this very strange. However, a lot of people have been told that, well, from police officers, they kind of alluded that Darlie just kept stating, oh, I touched it. Oh, the finger, like, what about the fingerprints, blah, blah, blah. But Darlie only ever mentioned these things when she was questioned about them, which is fair enough. She just answered the questions. That was also, I personally don't find that strange. Darlie is, obviously, she's frantically trying to get them to get there very quickly, and this is when Detective Waddell, he arrives, I think within about 3 minutes. Luckily he was within the area, so he just had to turn a couple of corners in order to get to the address. Once Waddell arrives at the scene, Darlie is screaming to him that the man had run into the garage, and Waddell was kind of under the impression that the man was still in the garage. However, he couldn't go and check because he needed another officer with him in order to do so. So he kind of like tried to block the entrance from the garage into, you know, the main living area. So he kind of stood in between the area to get to the garage and between the Routiers. So it's said that Darlie is just running frantically to and from the living room and the kitchen, whilst Darren is performing CPR on Damon, and he's still trying to perform CPR on Devon even though he is dead. But obviously he, you know, you don't want to believe that at all. Police officers found that Darlie's behaviour was very strange, and they found that the actual scene itself was very odd. There was glass on the floor, however, Darlie didn't seem to have any cuts on her feet, and she was the one that was sort of running to and from. There was a screen in the garage that had been cut with a knife, and the knife was apparently in the house. So officers immediately found that quite strange, because they thought that how could they have cut the screen from outside the house with a knife that's inside the house? So they kind of quickly suspected Darlie. I think the police officers had tunnel vision, and initially, like straight away, they just looked straight at Darlie. They thought her behaviour was suspicious, the whole scene was suspicious, so they had her as the #1 culprit from the get-go. So Waddell claims that he asked Darlie to give CPR to one of the boys, but allegedly Darlie did not do this. She just stood there and she just had a towel to her wounds, and she just didn't really do anything. However, Darlie and Darren both state that this just was not true at all. They both claim that Darlie was like frantically running to and from to grab towels to help with the boys' injuries, and she was constantly trying to help and trying to do everything that she could, but the police stated otherwise. What we need to remember, it was just Waddell at the time. He was the only officer that was there, so it was basically his word against the Routiers. And it is also, so this is just quite interesting to know, it is also heard on the 911 call that Waddell stated that he asked Darlie to tend to the boys and to help them, but it was actually heard on the 911 call. He didn't say that. He actually told Darlie to sit down, because obviously what we need to remember, she had a really severe wound. If they had cut like 1.5 inches deeper, she would have died. So she was probably all over the place. Like, she was having to deal with her children dying in front, well, one of them dead and the other one died in front of her, and she also had this horrendous wound as well. So her mental state, and that probably wasn't all there. She probably wasn't coherent as well. So at 2:36 a.m, paramedics arrive. Whilst Sergeant Walling still has not arrived yet. And once the paramedics are there, it is determined that Devon is dead, whilst Damon is still clinging on by a thread. Just a minute later, at 2:37 a.m, Sergeant Walling arrives at the scene. And as soon as he arrives, him and Waddell basically trade places. Waddell goes and stands outside, out on the porch, to basically take guard. Paramedics then take Damon to the hospital, whilst Devon is left at the scene because he's dead. He was basically left there to help investigators evaluate the scene a bit better. But sadly, Damon dies whilst in the ambulance. Darren calls a neighbour named Karen, who is a nurse, and he asks her to come over and pick Drake up so that she could obviously look after them, because Darren wanted to go to the hospital, and Darlie was taken to the emergency room, where it was just quickly determined that she needed to have an operation. She needed surgery ASAP because her injuries were that bad. And at 3:40 a.m, Darlie is taken down for surgery. And just 10 minutes later, the operation begins. And at 4:49, the surgery and the anaesthesia ends. And at 6 a.m, whilst Darlie is in ICU, an ICU nurse comes to tend to Darlie, and she actually gives Darlie Demerol for the pain. And just 11 minutes later, detectives come to question Darlie, which I know I said I weren't going to give my opinion, but this I just find to be really shitty police work. She had just had a major operation, her children had just died, and she was also given Demerol, which I'm just going to read the side effects to you in a second. The effects of Demerol are as following: respiratory depression, dizziness, lightheadedness, nausea, vomiting, dysphoria, euphoria, confusion, headaches, agitation, severe convulsions, transient hallucinations, disorientation, visual disturbances, and delirium. So I think we should all take that into consideration and just keep it in mind, because what we need to realise is that Darlie was first interviewed by the police around an hour after she just had major surgery. Not only did she just have major surgery, she was under this kind of medication as well, which, like I've just said, does affect your mental state. Not only that as well, she had just been brutally stabbed and lost her 2 children. So, would she have been quite confused during this interrogation? Yeah, of course. And what kind of led police to, well, one of the reasons why the police initially saw Darlie as a suspect was the fact that she changed her story. Her first story did differ slightly from when she was interviewed again, because overall Darlie does get interviewed by the police 4 times, and her first story does differ for the second, but then after that she sticks to her story, and she has stuck to the same story ever since. So Darlie initially said that she woke up to a man. When she was on the phone, she said she woke up to a man hovering over her. But then when she was actually formally interviewed by the police while she was in hospital, Darlie stated that she woke up to some pressure on her, and it was Damon who was leaning against her. So she woke up, and then she was faced with this man who had just brutally murdered her 2 children. So police also found it quite strange that Darlie didn't feel having her throat badly cut, and woke up not realising she had this wound initially. But her husband does believe that maybe Darlie was perhaps asphyxiated. She may have been strangled, and then she, due to that, become unconscious, and when she come to, realised she had been stabbed, and that's when, well, we all know. So that is a possibility that could happen. On June the 8th is when Darlie is released from hospital, just 2 days after the attack and the murder of her 2 children. So the police requested a second interview from Darlie, so she decided to stop by the police station on her way home. And this is when Darlie's statement naturally becomes more informative and detailed, which of course it would, because the events of what happened are probably starting to come to a bit better. So she has this interview, and then just 2 days later, on June the 10th, the police interviewed Darlie for the 3rd time, and they take pictures of her injuries for the 2nd time. The first time was whilst Darlie was in hospital. During this time as well, a blood-stained sock is found in an alley 75 yards away from the home. The blood-stained sock is one of the vital components to people believing that Darlie could potentially be innocent, because from the time of the phone call, the time that Darlie had given of when she woke up and the man had killed her 2 children and she ran and he left the house, from the time that she then called emergency operators and from the time that the police had arrived, there was literally no time for Darlie to have grabbed this sock and ran 75 yards away from her home and placed it in an alleyway in order to get back and continue the phone call and wait for the police. The police arrived within 3 minutes and she was on the phone the entire time. So that never really seemed possible, but this was an important piece of evidence which police just kind of let slide. I think they had their target. They felt like they had their person, and any other information that differed from their theory, they just cast it aside. Now I'm going to talk about June the 14th. This day in particular is vital, and this is what becomes the catalyst to Darlie's inevitable sentencing. So on this particular day, it would have been Devon's 7th birthday. I don't know if you're familiar with this case, you would have seen the footage of this.
We had a graveside prayer service and then later had kind of a birthday party because Devon's birthday invitations had already gone out. Some of the neighborhood kids came.
Happy birthday to you.
They sprayed silly string, which took maybe 20 seconds. They sang happy birthday, and you hear Darlie and Darren both saying,
Love you, Devin and Damon.
you know, just like they're still there.
Why the confetti? Why the balloons? Why the happy birthday song?
Well, because even though we're sad because Devin and Damon aren't here, we try to hang on to what we can to get us through these times.
So on this day is when Darlie, her husband, their families and all of the neighbourhood kids and their parents, they all come to the boy's grave for like a memorial service and kind of like a birthday party. So as you can imagine, and this is how Darlie explained it as well, as you can imagine, the children were very close to Damon and Devon, and they were in and out of Darlie's house constantly. She felt close to these children. She was close with their parents, and obviously, as you can imagine, they were kids. They didn't really understand the concept of death, and they were having to deal with the reality of what had happened on that night. So I think for a way to make such a horrific incident a bit positive and a bit more, well, it was bittersweet. So Darlie just wanted to make the best out of it, the best out of a horrific situation. So she decided to throw like a celebration. She wanted to celebrate the boys' lives. And rather than spending that day just, which obviously they did cry, I watched the footage, they wanted to remember all of the good times, which I do understand. However, the full footage during the trial was never shown. And I've seen the full footage, and you see Darlie, there are times when she's like bawling, she's just in such a state, and so is Darren as well. And then there are times when she's smiling and laughing, and at the end of the day, we can all judge and say, you wouldn't be smiling just a few days after your child died, blah, blah. Unless you've been through it, you really can't comment. You really don't know how it feels. I don't, so I personally am keeping an open mind. I think when you've lost 2 children in such a horrific way, your mental state would be all over the place. You may be displaying some kind of, I don't know, maybe behaviour, some kind of bipolar tendencies. So you may be up and down, you may be manic and then depressive, and so maybe that is how it affected Darlie. I don't know, but that's just my personal opinion. And there is a particular part, it's literally like 20 seconds of the footage, and it's where Darlie sprays silly string over the boys' graves. Now, this just infuriated everyone. This was all over the media, so everyone that had watched this was so angry. The police, the investigators, they were absolutely fuming when they saw this, because they just thought, she's a mother, how can she be behaving like that? That's just disgusting. And I think she just, like I said, she just wanted to make it a celebration. And what do you do at a party? You have like silly string and party poppers and silly things like that, and she just wanted to make it somewhat positive and happy and uplifting for the neighbourhood kids and for themselves. So I don't think it was heinous at all. I don't think it was as horrific as what it was made out to be at all. So 4 days later, on June the 18th, Darlie submits a 4th voluntary interview. This is during a time the police, they know, they've got their person. They feel like the perpetrator, person to murder those 2 young boys, was their mother. So they already had a warrant for Darlie's arrest, even though the evidence was technically circumstantial. There wasn't really a lot of proof to prove that it was Darlie. There was no kind of motive. There was no reasoning for her to do it whatsoever. But the police felt like they had their person. During this interview, Darlie is told midway through that they have a warrant for her arrest. And during this time, Darlie doesn't have an attorney at all. But Darlie continues to talk for an hour, and that's when she asks for an attorney, but she's then later arrested. So now we're going to talk about the trial. So the trial officially begins on January the 6th, 1997. The opening statements and first witnesses are called at trial. One of the witnesses during this trial was one of Darlie's friends, and this became quite a crucial piece of evidence against Darlie. And this was a close friend of Darlie's who had stated that Darlie had suffered with mental health issues previously. She had suffered with depression, and she had wrote a note a month prior to this, and it basically just says that she can't go on anymore and she's really sorry, and she hopes that all of them forgive her, like her sons and Darren forgive her for what she's about to do, and she just can't live anymore, and she just felt like everyone just asked too much of her. For some bizarre reason, this seemed to prove that Darlie was capable of killing her sons because she had suicidal thoughts, which I just find absolutely ridiculous. You can suffer with mental health issues and not kill your kids. I have suffered with mental health issues. I've previously suffered with depression, severe depression at one point, and I have suffered with suicidal thoughts. I also have BPD, so my behaviour, it can go very up and down, but there has never been a moment since having my son that I have ever wanted to cause him any harm in any kind of way whatsoever. And I don't think that's fair that people with mental health issues are seen as a danger to other people around them. Okay, there can be, but there are people that have been completely sane and have never had any kind of mental health issues and have caused such harm and such evilness in the world. So I just don't think it's fair. So January the 31st, attorneys make their closing statements and the jury begins their deliberations. Just literally a day later, the jury return a guilty verdict. The death penalty was already on the cards because she was being she was being tried for Damon's murder, who was under 5. And in Texas, if you kill someone who is under 5, it is immediately the death sentence. I don't know why she was never tried for Devon's murder, but she wasn't. It was only ever Damon's. On February the 4th, after 1 day of sentencing testimony, the jury sentences Darlie to death by lethal injection. Darlie is still, to this day, and has maintained her innocence. Darren has always stood by Darlie, and he's always protested that Darlie is innocent. And although they're not married now, like they divorced and Darren is now married to someone else, even to this day, he still protests that Darlie is completely innocent and she would never have harmed her 2 children. Both families have continued to fight for justice for Darlie because they all believe that she was innocent, and unfortunately, due to Darren constantly sticking by Darlie, he actually lost custody to Drake, and Drake had to go and live with his grandparents. And although Darren was granted regular visits, but yeah, he was not allowed to have full custody of his son, which is just, it's just incredibly sad. So now we're going to get on to the injustice part of it all. A lot of pieces of evidence that were missed or were just cast aside by the police because they just didn't want to look into it. They didn't want to look into any other possible suspects. So I'm going to go into that. I'm going to give you my opinion, and then that will be it. That will be the end of the video, and then you guys can comment and let me know what you guys think, because this case has struck up a lot of debate. I know there are a lot of people that think that Darlie's innocent. I know there's a lot of people that think she's guilty as hell. So it'll be interesting to hear your guys' views on that. So first we'll go into the evidence that officers had against Darlie and the evidence that they used to prosecute her. Like I touched on, the note that Darlie wrote a month prior stating her suicidal thoughts. And then there is the infamous silly string video, which prosecutors only showed the jury 20 seconds of the whole footage. That was it, just 20 seconds, which is literally just showing Darlie spraying silly string over her son's grave. That was it. The jury actually stated that if they were shown the full footage, because afterwards obviously they had researched the case some more, I guess, and watched the full footage, they had stated that they would have not chosen the guilty verdict if they had seen the full footage. But they were only shown the silly string part over and over and over again. And that ultimately determined their verdict. And then there is the motive, which is just absolutely ridiculous. Prosecutors claim that Darlie was tired of her children intruding on her life. Because a lot of people, the police especially, had a very negative opinion on Darlie's appearance because she was very well kept. She had a boob job, she liked to wear nice clothes and have makeup on. So apparently she was a mother because of that, which is just absolutely ridiculous. And yeah, the police and a lot of people just had a very negative opinion on her. They felt like she should have not have had her boobs done and just worn cardigans and high-waisted chinos all the time and never have worn makeup, because apparently that's what makes a good mother. But like, appearance has zero to do with your parenting skills, but that's obviously what a lot of people at the time thought, and so did the police. Prosecutors believe that Darlie was just tired of her children. She wanted to go out and live the single life, which anyone that knew Darlie just protested that. They thought that was absolutely ridiculous. She loved her children. And if she was, I personally think, she had an 8-month-old baby Drake who she didn't kill. And to me, an 8-month-old is a lot more dependable and can be a lot more stressful than a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old. So why would she have not killed the baby as well if they were also intrusive and they were such a burden on her life? Why would she not have killed all of them? And there was an insurance policy out on the 2 boys, which was literally only just $5,000. That's her reasoning for it. She killed her 2 children for $5,000, which is just absolutely ridiculous. It's a ridiculous motive, but That is what prosecutors believed that Darlie's motive was. Then there is, apparently, there were witnesses from the hospital that claimed that Darlie just did not seem to be showing any emotion whatsoever, and she was just very withdrawn. But like I've said, people grieve differently. I don't think there's a textbook definition of how to grieve for someone you love. There's just not. You just don't know until you experience it. Then there was the sock, which was found in an alley, and it contained a stain of blood which had both Damon and Devon's blood on it. But prosecutors claim that Darlie planted that sock, but as we know, there is just no way she could have done that. But that was the last piece of evidence that prosecutors had. So I'm sure you can imagine that this is just utterly ridiculous. Like, this evidence is just not enough to be able to convict someone to death. And now I'm just going to go through with the evidence that could potentially have proven that there was an intruder. There was a knife found within the Routiers' home, and this knife apparently was used to cut the screen to get into from one of the windows to get into the home, and there was residue found on it that had from the screen. But this knife actually belonged to the Routiers. It was a kitchen knife. So prosecutors claimed that the knife obviously come from inside the house, so the perpetrator must have been someone from within the house, because and it must have been staged. Darlie must have killed the boys and then staged the whole scene, grabbing a knife from the kitchen and then cutting the screen to make it look like an intruder had come in. However, later on, after the trial, it was actually found that it wasn't residue from the screen at all. It was actually residue used from a cleaning tool to clean that knife. The next piece of evidence is, on the night of the murders, neighbours had spotted a black car parked very close to the Routiers' residence. And a few nights leading up to that, very frequently, this car kept circling the area. Also, Darren admitted to considering staging a break-in in order to claim back on insurance. He had mentioned it to, I think it was Darlie's stepfather, and he had mentioned it to various other people as well. So a lot of people kind of theorised that maybe it was Darren, maybe he had come up with this idea to stage a robbery. Maybe the intruder wasn't supposed to kill anyone, but I don't know, maybe it all went wrong and they weren't expecting Darlie and the boys to be sleeping downstairs. Maybe they thought that they were going to all be sleeping upstairs and they could have just quickly come in and roughed up the place and stole a few things and then just left. But obviously they were interrupted by Darlie and the two boys, so maybe that's what happened. A person who lived just 2 roads away on the night of the boys' murder, she claimed that on that very night she was in the living room with her daughter when 2 men tried to break into her home. She managed to scare them off and they fled. But one of the men matched the description of Darlie's description of her intruder, and that was on the very night that the boys were murdered. See, Sergeant Walling and Woodell as well, they both claimed that during Darlie's phone call with the emergency operator, she was just, and to them as well, she was constantly saying, oh, I've touched the knife, oh, my DNA is I'm gonna mess up the DNA, blah, 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 which they obviously found to be quite strange, because they thought, well, why are you so concerned with that right now, because your kids have just died. But having listened to the 911 call myself, it didn't seem like she was just randomly mentioning that. She was asked when the 911 operator actually said to her, look, don't touch anything, and then Darlie responded and said, I touched the knife, I grabbed it, I picked it up.
Okay, there's is 82 out on Eagle? Okay, it's all right. It's okay. We got the press, baby. Hang on a second. We walked in here and did it, Derek. Okay, ma'am. Ma'am, is the police officer there? Okay, go talk to him, okay? Yes, that's okay. Go talk to him, though. Okay?
If you saw a knife, knew that there was an intruder in your house, you would grab, well, you would grab any kind of weapon. And if there's a knife in front of you, you would grab that. So yeah. Apparently during the trial, there were a few medical professionals that stated that Darlie's cut was self-inflicted, it was superficial. However, San Antonio Chief Medical Examiner Vincent Di Maio, he testified that the wound to Routier's neck came within 2 millimeters of a carotid artery, and it was not consistent with self-inflicted wounds which he had seen in the past. There was also an unknown male fingerprint DNA found, I think it was on one of the windowsills within the home. However, it was never tested and it was never looked into. So that is it for all of the evidence. You can all come up with your own conclusions there. I personally think that Darlie is innocent, I really do. But there probably are a lot of people that are going to disagree with me on that. Darlie has always maintained her innocence, even up until this day. And this case is still ongoing because DNA testing and everything else is so much more advanced now than it was back then. DNA testing is still being done on this case. So maybe they might find something, or maybe they won't. I don't know. But for me personally, I think Darlie was innocent. I don't know who I think it may be. I think maybe it was an attempted robbery. I think maybe this person was circling the area for a few days to kind of eye up all the houses, eye up the structure of the homes, the people that are in them, and kind of find their most vulnerable target. And they may have landed on the Routier home, knowing that she was a young mother with 3 children. And maybe he went into the home to steal a lot of stuff, maybe he couldn't find anything, or maybe he was disrupted by the boys and Darlie and killed the 2 boys and then attempted to kill Darlie. Or maybe there is the other theory that Darren had decided to hire someone to break into the home. That is a possibility. Maybe he decided against it and he decided not to do it, and then that person just went ahead and decided to do it anyway, because he probably at this point had all of the details about the home, about who lives there, what times they're there and what times they go to bed, and he just decided to go within that home knowing that Darren did have money and they did have a big huge house and they probably had a lot of valuables, so he decided to just go ahead anyway and was disrupted by the boys and unfortunately murdered them. So I think it could be one of two. I definitely think it was an intruder. I really don't think that there was enough evidence to have convicted Darlie, especially to death. And it is a case that I just feel really strongly about. Like, this case, it is quite well known and I don't really like to do this kind of cases, but it's just been niggling at me for a while. I've done a lot of research on it, just not for fun, but just because it interests me and I just want to find out more about it. And then I just decided I do want to talk about it because I personally think she's innocent. And I would love to hear what you guys think. If you think I'm wrong, fine. You know, try and give me an intelligent reasoning for that. Tell me exactly what you think. I would love to hear it. And if you do agree with me, also tell me your reasoning for that as well. and who maybe you think it is. So yeah, that is it for this week. That is it for the Darlie Routier case. I've really enjoyed doing this case, as sad as what it is, obviously. I've really enjoyed doing it. It's just, like I said, it's just a really interesting case, and it's one that is pretty much still ongoing. And an innocent woman could potentially be put to death. We don't know when. So yeah, that is it for this week, and thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your continued support. Obviously this video is going up quite late. It was supposed to be on last week, but I have been really ill and I hate having to let you guys down, but I just slept so much last week. I just felt really just lethargic and rubbish. But I've had some really nice messages on Instagram, and you've all just been so great and so supportive and very understanding, so thank you for that. And I will be back again next week for another episode of Toxic Crime Tuesday, so make sure to stay tuned and to watch that, and I will see you guys next week. Bye guys.